Welcome to the Mixed Life ATL podcast. In this installment, we join Mixed-ish as they tackle the plight of police in the Black community and our present-day outrage with policing in America. Welcome back, everyone. This is Tarana and Shannon. Very appropriate that we are recording on Loving Weekend. I'm just going to go ahead and make it a weekend, y'all, but Loving Day annually is June 12th. It celebrates the day in 1967 when the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Warren, cast down laws prohibiting marriage between whites and non-whites. In the case of Richard and Mildred Loving, a white man and a Black woman, against the state of Virginia. Let's be clear. They were arrested in 1958 for being married. This is not too long ago. Please do learn more about their case because it is just one of many examples of how racism has been baked into laws and systems and therefore the subconsciousness of America. You can learn more about the Lovings in their other episodes of this podcast and the other episodes of this podcast. And we encourage you to also watch the documentary Loving Generation about the children born in the early 70s to people of mixed marriages. Mm-hmm. I will say that the Lovings in part gave me personally the courage to identify as biracial because I could not stand to fold to the white supremacy that made their union and their marriage and even their children, quote, illegal. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a very, very beautiful celebration every year. And so you will hear a little heaviness in my heart right now as I talk about it. Typically it's a very, very celebratory moment, very encouraging and positive. But I just feel like it's just one more example that we're talking about in these times, these troubled times. And, but it is, I do believe love over fear. And I feel like the Lovings are a wonderful example of that. And as we talk about systemic issues and laws, it's a really great segue to our current episode.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. This is Shannon, and we're going to take a deep breath as we begin this podcast. So we've had all kinds of emotions leading up to the recording because we knew that Mixed-ish episode 20 called Bad Boys that covers the topic of police in the Black community was coming up in our lineup. And we determined we'd cover this a while ago. And like COVID with Dr. Doctor episode, we wouldn't have known, or who would have known rather, we'd be covering such a current and world-changing cases of police brutality at the same time. And I, for one, am fresh off watching the multiple funerals of George Floyd, preparing for this and the worldwide protests in his honor and for the fight for justice, and the varying hard and emotionally charged talks I've been having with kids about the reality of their Black existence. And we even marched in a family-friendly protest where my 4-year-old was yelling, "No justice, no peace." Mm-hmm. So just taking all that in and processing that and covering this topic is right on time. And today I'm letting some of these things off my chest a bit. What about you, Tarana? Thoughts on knowing we were getting ready to record on this topic today?
Well, first off, the events surrounding George Floyd's murder and torture on television and having to explain to my kids, I feel like it's given me a new boldness. Because the time is now. We've said that in so many generations gone by. But I just feel like it's made it. I can't be quiet. I can't be silent anymore. I can teach people from my personal experience, and so as part of this podcast, I wanted to commit to doing that. But I'm also doing that within my social network. So that's what I think about when I think of these moments pushing us all personally to a new place. That's what it's done for me. Yeah. But back to Mixed-ish, the episode, Bad Boys. The first thing I taught when we talk about growing up mixed race in the 80s, right. I thought immediately of DARE, the DARE program, and Nancy Reagan, and how, again, the system that was created, these policies that were created.
The war on drugs,
2 strikes and you're out. All of this, with this theme being the foundational laws of our country, the policies of our country, the systems of our country. I couldn't help think about growing up in that time when it was being so pressed into everybody's brain. Not that it was a bad thing. Drug education is very important, but thinking about all the negative things that came out of those policies. And they were actually racially tinged, right? So I thought about DARE. I have not had a personal experience with racism in the police. I'm so glad to say. So I cannot speak to that part of all of this. But I will tell you that the first time my girls met a police officer, they drew back. They're little, y'all. They're 5 and 7. And this is a couple of years ago even. And we had tried to keep them from the news. There have been many incidents in their young lives already where this was on the news and what mommy and daddy were watching. We tried to turn it off and hide it from them, but they still see it. Mm-hmm. They're in the room and you don't know it. And so their first reaction was to be upset.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder, they're 7 and 5 right now.
And they're brown girls.
Yeah.
And so they quite naturally see what's happening and they see the dynamic immediately. And even though we tried to shoo them out of the room and get them redirected, that stays with them. Mm-hmm. And so we were letting them watch more now because it's a huge teachable moment. And we cannot wait. I cannot have my children not knowing the world they're growing up in and contextualize it for them in a healthy and loving way. Right. So that's what I also thought about as we came into this episode. Yeah. There's no explaining, we talked to them about good officers and bad officers, but there is no explaining this brutality away, especially as full-fledged adults in positions of power. They can watch this and be just as helpless to fix it as my young girls. It's just really overwhelming. And we record this episode now amidst fallout in Atlanta over yet another incident of police brutality that ended in murder, Rayshard Brooks, since George Floyd's death. And I feel as though we are in a tinderbox ready to explode. So in addition to anger and hurt and dismay, I sit in this eerie state of anticipation for more unrest to come. Yeah. But again, I want to point out how on pulse the show Mixed-ish is, because especially as a sitcom, they could have skipped over this, right? They could have skipped over racism in law enforcement, and they didn't. And I think how they wrote the episode was a form of protest, and I'm grateful, a peaceful form of protest, and I'm grateful how they wove so many different point of views on a topic that truly affects all Americans. So thank you, Mixed-ish.
Yes, agree. And with that, it's a lot, and there will be a lot more to come in this episode. But, we want to get into some of the storylines in the episode. But I should point out that I was curious about the title Bad Boys because it could be based on several 80s tunes, actually. And when I really looked at, all the titles, I mean, the Mixed-ish writers are so clever. If you Google 80s tunes, Bad Boys, and the artists that come up, I remember all of these. Gloria Estefan with Miami Sound Machine called Bad Boy, if you remember her song. George Michael with Wham called Bad Boys. And then Bad Boys, You Make Me Feel So Good.
I remember that one.
By Lisa M., who's Puerto Rican, I believe. I think that's the artist. And I just remember all of them. They're all good. Classics.
Shout out to 80s music.
So, yes. And so we'll have to make sure to share the videos on the blog. But, okay. So this episode, we see two stories happening. The first is Ethan participating in the after-school police academy. And alongside that, Bo is becoming part of the safety patrol at her school. And she's very serious about it. She takes it very seriously and maybe even too seriously, letting her newfound power get to her head a little bit. But, we're going to mostly focus on Ethan's storyline with his parents, and he's interested in a new after-school police academy program. And his parents, understanding that it's 1985, much like today, Black people have a more rough experience when it comes to the cops, relationship with the cops, rather. And of course, Dee Dee and Harrison have something to say. Dee Dee says, this sounds like snitch camp, which just yes, just get it in there. And then, Harrison has a more, I guess, blinded white male view where he's like, people think cops are just swinging billy clubs at anything with the tan. But the truth is, you stay out of trouble, they won't bother you, which we all know is not true.
Yeah, so that's great because right there you see the show contrasts those two differing points of view. These are all points of view in one family. And of course, this can happen in families that are all of one race. This is not deep, right? but you really start to getting into the layers of generation and race and their difference in how they see authority and how they see people who are meant to protect them.
Yeah.
With Harrison being, I think, very representative of someone of his generation, being because how old is Harrison in the sitcom? Probably 50s, mid 50s,
late 60s,
so,
I would say.
Late 60s, like 60-year-old white man,
Mm-hmm.
Upper middle class, and that is his take on things. When it comes to Ethan's parents, so Mom Alicia thinks that the after school program could be good because the cops then could be familiar with her son, and that would maybe minimize him being seen as a threat. She even tries to give the cop Ethan's picture to keep on his dashboard, as in, if you see him, like, please go gentle on my son, which is a very sad statement. But there's a lot of moms who wish they could put their son's picture on the dashboard of police. Their black son's picture, let's be very clear, on the dashboard of police. Then there's Ethan's dad, Paul, that doesn't want him there at all. Paul thinks they're putting him in harm's way. And he insists, this is the white parent, of course, in the family, Paul, and he insists on going with Johan to the after-school academy as a way to police the police and what they're teaching his son.
Right. He definitely doesn't trust him.
Shannon, what are your thoughts of seeing Alicia try to give the cop a picture of Johan? And maybe we could take a step back just really quick and talk about representations. I'm big on finding these moments in media, right, that really speak to these issues that people don't know how to talk about or they may have never experienced if they don't have people of color in their family. So one of those that you may have seen are two of those you may have seen, I should say, are two commercials by Procter and Gamble. One is called The Talk, and it's this beautiful commercial of parents, moms. Of course, their target is moms. This is advertising people, but it's moms talking to their kids about racism and the N-word, and the first time they encounter those moments, and they're teaching them. And then the other one, The Talk, which is awesome. The Look is about a black man moving through his day and all the looks he gets from the store to the workplace to the pool with his daughter. And then, of course, we find out he's a judge. And the look that he gets as a black man.
Very biased look.
A very biased look.
Yeah.
So very compelling ads. And I have to tell you that the head of brand, the chief brand officer for Procter & Gamble is, guess what? Biracial. Mark Pritchard, I've heard him speak on several occasions, gets emotional every time he talks about diversity and inclusion. And the reason he does is because he is Mexican. His dad was Mexican and his mom is white. And he at one point passed for white because he was ashamed to be Mexican. And he talks about this evolution of his, how he self-identifies in this speech he gives at conferences, multicultural conferences. And it's really powerful. But I say that to say, without someone like that, who has had this realization, being in a place of power to influence what goes on our televisions, you may have not gotten to that point, right? And they have a whole anti-bias campaign. So represent biracial people in America. But Shannon, I'm sorry. Back to the question, again, because you have these beautiful boys. What are your thoughts on seeing Alicia try and give the cop that picture of Johan?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think those commercials are amazing and breaks my heart. But, I definitely see why she felt this may help. And, they kind of break down, older Beau shares, as she narrates in the show, that she breaks down some history and says, we've all been aware of the police shooting unarmed Black boys. And in the 80s, mothers were well aware of the threat of police brutality. And they talk about it on the show and how often mothers would introduce their teenage sons to the police in hopes it would keep them safe. And I think in some ways it humanizes that individual son for the police, because they're looking, instead of just looking at Black boys as all, monolithic or whatever, that's exactly what the mothers are trying to do. They're trying to humanize their sons. And this burden continues to be passed down to Black people in order to protect our children, is what Beau says. And in 2020, obviously the trust of police hasn't changed. Police continue to shoot Black people, and they're trying to get slick with the chokeholds. And as we've seen with George Floyd's case, the knee on the neck. And, but it's still the same outcome, dead Black bodies. It's horrid. And this is why many Black people try to handle situations amongst their own community, because 9 times out of 10, the situations are escalated when the police arrive. And, they're to honor and serve and de-escalate the situation. And you're just not seeing that. And it's heartbreaking. 13th documentary, the new Jim Crow book, Just Mercy book and movie by Bryan Stevenson. These are definitely resources. I mean, there's tons of, other films and books out there. But, and I've talked before on a previous episode about my trip to the Equal Justice Initiative's Museum and Memorial in Montgomery. But just knowing that history is so important about policing in America. We've been explaining it to our sons, but it's gotten out of hand, obviously. Right. And, slavery patrols to the Klan, like Paul Rucker on this TED Talk I just recently watched. I meant to tell you about that. It's like a 7-minute TED Talk, was amazing. And just talking about, walks through a little bit of the history but specifically was saying that there's 3 waves of the Klan, which we have to just understand the relationship with the Klan and policing, both very brutal and violent ways of handling, trying to uphold white supremacy. And he was just saying, the 3 waves of the Klan. The second one in particular, there was more than 5 million active members in the United States, 5% of the population, which at the time was the size of New York City. And the Klan factory in Buckhead had 20,000 robes at all times because of the demand that they were producing.
Do you remember what year that was, the 3rd wave? Do you remember?
He didn't really break down the year. I'll have to go back.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah, I'll have to check it again to see if he actually said the year.
Wow, I had no idea.
I did not know Buckhead had that.
5 million active members at one point, and everyone tries to paint that as a fringe group.
Right, like it's just a couple.
Interesting.
But a couple people of the community, but it's not. And it was leaders of the community, the mayors, the police chiefs. They were all interwoven into that. And understanding, even going back to slavery, that wealth from slavery, 1860 was $200 million, which would equal to $5 billion today. So it was, we see that through generational wealth, and it was, often the indigo, rice, tobacco, and cotton fields, that were creating this income. So they were going to protect this, is the point. They were going to uphold the power financially.
To do whatever they had to do to keep that. Money is a huge driver of so much of this. And
of so much economically.
We see that modern day with, but the NFL only faced with destabilization this last week, of having their season thrown off because of the players speaking up about George Floyd. Did they finally step to the table and admit that changes need to happen? But I believe it was because of money.
Yeah, it's money and power, and it, going back back to slave patrols and slavery, there was, no 40 acres and a mule that was given to try to balance that out, and going then into segregation and Jim Crow laws and Civil Rights Act that leads to redlining. And in the 80s, we had the war on drugs, like you said, about DARE, and then zero tolerance policing, the crackdown on minor crimes and the saturation of police in low-income areas, the stop and frisk recently that gave license to intimidate and lock mostly Black and brown people up. And then we have police carrying military-level weapons and the militarization of the police in this country as a whole, as Bishop William Barber so eloquently talks about on a couple different resources, but most recently Oprah's town hall. But it doesn't really need explaining, does it? I mean, we've all seen it displayed throughout the protests, riots, and looting recently, I mean, as recent as just this weekend, it has gotten out of hand. And, I mean, I'm not surprised that Alicia and Paul are, having this battle and kind of conflict about what's going to happen with Johan and going to this police academy. I mean, it would be hard for me to just openly send my kids.
Well, that's a really important point. Again, yes, this is a 21-minute sitcom, but it's so packed because on one hand, what Alicia and Paul represent in the sitcom is engage, right? There's two strategies we can take to go about fixing this or protecting ourselves in this system. We can engage with the system, which is what Alicia was trying to do. And then Paul was saying, don't go anywhere near it, avoid it, whatever, so avoid and engage, I think, is what they represented there. So I wasn't surprised to see Beau's white father, say that Johan probably shouldn't be part of this because
going into protective mode, kind of, and
because he comes from a place of challenging authority, right, and questioning archaic systems in America. He's a former civil rights protester. That's what Paul's background is and how he met, maybe some of how he met Alicia on the show. But there are plenty of white fathers, even if they parented biracial children, who might not understand this complexity of a biracial boy idolizing the police, right? So I don't even think Paul even quite understood where Alicia was coming from, because he didn't have to grow up jumping through hoops just not to be killed by the very people who are supposed to protect him. But I really appreciated seeing Paul and Alicia work this out together as parents. And it really shows that even though they are married, Alicia and Paul still have to teach one another about where they're coming from, which I believe we all bear that responsibility in our lives, in our personal spaces, in our communities. And we bear the responsibility to listen when someone is trying to tell you about their experience. I want to just take a beat and just say that image of Alicia in the car being pulled over by police was also really powerful in the sitcom. And I think so even women, right, have this, clear that even this is, it's shaky ground for women too. And we see that fear in her face. And again, somehow they managed to do this in a sitcom, which I'm not sure how, because we still laugh plenty in this sitcom.
Again, I mean, it's just so packed. Like, for sure, every time, I see police or think that I see headlights in my rear view thinking that they might be pulling me over, and then they pass by and all of a sudden I'm able to breathe again. Like, it literally is, it is terrifying now. It's post-traumatic stress we're dealing with here as a nation and as a community. And, it's such a big point, and I think we definitely will need to explore this more in future podcasts, but just the Paul and Alicia, how they love each other. They're willing to listen to each other and reconcile and understand their experiences are different, that they're coming together to make a new experience is like so symbolic for how our country could maybe move forward, very powerful.
Paul and Alicia for president.
these relationships are very, there's going to be tension. The tension exists, but how do you move together? Because the reality is not going to change about the history of each of their experiences. So it's interesting, but, I have 2 Black sons and a Black husband, and I definitely have had a lot of anxiety and fear for them. My second son was born shortly before the last wave of media outrage, so to speak, for Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Trayvon Martin, and just to name a few. And I had a visceral reaction that led to a very deep depression, I'll be honest, that ultimately came from just losing hope in the whole system. But there is so much more to that story, but I'm just so happy to say that through much work, I'm at a much better place because I can sit here and boldly have these discussions now. And before, with the depression, I couldn't have them. And to a certain degree, I'm thankful for them, for sure, for that, experience, that particular circumstance in my life, because out of that came something greater that I could have imagined, is just walking in my purpose and being able to sit here and talk about this. And, everything that's going on right now, I could have been like a puddle on the ground right now, able to talk about these things in the midst of this basically another major civil rights movement that we're seeing right now, and all the protests. But yeah, I think I would let my kids participate in the police academy activity, probably with lots of supervision like Paul. And I would want to know the curriculum up front, being the nerdy, nerd that I am. But I know my boys have gone through, growing up to, well, I'll talk about it in a little bit, like I guess a little bit later as we get further into this episode. But Johan, he comes back from the camp super excited and says it was so great and that he got to sit in the back of a police car. So that would make me cringe. That would make me cringe if my boy said that, but we have been drilling into their heads, my husband and I, that there are good cops and bad cops, which is daunting to hear. That, but just because little kids are taught that police are their local heroes, and so it kind of community heroes.
And there's a whole unit on this, right?
Yes.
In kindergarten. So
when you all of a sudden hear that a policeman killed somebody, or that there's just this unrest with the police in the Black community because of so much racial profiling, and they're not understanding racial profiling at 6 and 7 years old, so there's definitely steps to how to talk about it, but it's heartbreaking to have these conversations, and that we're in 2020 having to have them still, and we recently participated in a local family friendly protest about a week ago. And to prepare the kids, we watched like the CNN Sesame Street town hall that they had on racism, and also watched a kid-friendly history lesson on protests, riots, looting, and prejudice from Be the Bridge, the Racial Reconciliation Ministry. And the teaching on that was amazing. They cited, the Boston Tea Party, just how protesting and riots, and looting is not new. This isn't something that just happened just now in 2020. There's lots of history, but they cited specifically the Boston Tea Party and how, folks were dressed up as indigenous people trying to, get them in trouble rather, or disguise themselves, which is amazing to throw, the tea over the side of the boats. Nat Turner's rebellion, slavery rebellion, and the Rodney King beating was awful. There was a nice book read by that. There's a children's book, which is interesting. But they we've even used the book called The Gospel of Color by Jarvis Williams and Curtis Woods, and that has prepared us all immensely as a family. So anyways, through, lots of talks, discussions leading up to it, by the time we were headed to the protest, our family was more than ready and actually excited. And the kids didn't feel scared and felt empowered to speak out. And so it was something to walk with them. They made their own signs, we're like screaming Black Lives Matter, just for all of us to yell felt so good, but it just brings, us back to just mothering in this climate, being a Black mother, mothering Black children, raising Black children is, it's hard. There's just a difference from the white community. My neighbor friend and fellow school mom, Ariane Johnson, has a social media page called The Mother Thing Coming, and she shared just some of the experiences that we face that just in the Black community that, is not typical for white families, like just convincing the world of our worth, of their worth, teaching them how to respond to racism is a burden, protecting their school innocence, their childhood innocence rather, educating them on their history, worrying about unequal opportunities, worrying about the child being perceived as a threat, which is awful, choosing daycares and schools that have representation, feeling pressure to have well-behaved children all the time, inspiring them to break stereotypes, teaching them to love their skin and their hair, making sure that they have Black and brown friends. I mean, these are just some of the things, but so much more to say. I'm like on a rant, but
no, I think that perspective
we should go back to the show.
We'll go back to the show, but
yeah,
Shannon, it's really important, and we try to do in this podcast more than just review the show. Right?
Yes,
we try to use it as a jumping off point. So I think it's so important that people hear all that's on your mind and my mind. But in that way, you so eloquently explain exactly what's going on with your family right now. I think people need to know that. We're not, we say, oh, let's talk to your kids. Well, talking to kids is just one step. And the point is to understand how much more parents of color have to do, when really it's everyone's burden to do.
Right.
Really should be. But hopefully that gave people a snapshot. If you're wondering what's going on in homes right now, as we're explaining these things to our kids, I think that was a great snapshot that Shannon gave.
Thanks, girl.
And I'm going to tape this graphic to my wall.
Yeah, we're definitely
we're going to share this graphic of mothering Black children so that you can enjoy it. Okay, back to the show. So later, Dee Dee and Paul are watching the results of a court decision sentencing a man to 42 years for a minor crime.
Black man specifically.
A Black man, excuse me, not just a man. Dee Dee says, "This is why I'm single," hinting at the large statistic about Black men making up the majority of our prison population. This showed, and then of course, this show just does not miss an opportunity to teach and has something for everyone. But because that's a whole other podcast, right? Yeah. And we'll have the link to 13th on our blog. But so Paul says, during the civil rights movement, I watched guys serve time in cities that they'd never even been to. Yeah. And they did a great job in this episode of highlighting some of the injustice, but more so many Black people's feelings that because of recent cases, more and more people are becoming aware. Corporations are stepping up to learn, involve themselves, and invest more in the Black community.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? I'm ready for some change, some serious change. I know we all are. Our government needs to step in and make police reform and rebuild it completely. And there has been, obviously there's been so much protest in response to the recent cases, of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and especially George Floyd. And now we have this unfortunate Atlanta case with Rayshard Brooks. But there have been tons of news specials as well, and town halls, like Oprah's 2-part town hall that she had a packed list of experts and guests, and included Ava DuVernay and Nicole Hannah-Jones, Bishop William Barber, Georgia's own Stacey Abrams, and Atlanta's own Keisha Lance Bottoms, to name a few. But this was an interesting town hall discussion that I encourage everyone to watch. Some may, say to disband or disfund the police, but as a solution, but those particular words have started to cause unrest. And so then we have others asking to use new terms so that there isn't the unrest. And the new terms are, reform the police. It's like $6 billion. They said that that was invested to militarize the police. And I know, as kids, we didn't see those machine guns, with police carrying those. They've talked about rebuilding the police, retrain the police, rather. So like 10 cities with the largest police departments paid out $1.02 billion in misconduct settlements over 5 years. And cops often see no conviction because of the policy called qualified immunity to safeguard them. So, retraining sounds appropriate, and reprioritize in investments. Rather than invest in the police, invest in stable housing, mental health, and community organizations, in youth programs. And, the majority of 911 calls are for mental health issues. So, it would be amazing if there was, I've talked about this with one of my friends a lot. If even in the schools, there's always like one counselor, and that one counselor is handling the most extreme of cases, Everyone needs mental health, and even the teachers. So we need more support I just always go back to schooling now with 3 kids in school. So,
well, there's a big movement right now of mental health in schools, and I mean, it's getting better in terms of our awareness, right? So that's a perfect example where parents can be advocates in their own local school for these things that can sustain and supplement your own community.
Yeah.
But I will say, sorry, did you have something else to add?
It just would be amazing to have that support there.
So when we're talking about reform, just remember that institutions are made of people. Okay. So when we're talking about these one-on-one experiences that we had growing up, part of our goal here is to reach out across the airwaves and just promote understanding. So if you can do that in a microcosm of way, one person at a time, right. That is where we invite you to engage and invite you to engage more with this podcast. We will make sure all of our resources are listed, on our blog, mixedlifeatl.com. These are tough discussions about police that aren't getting easier, but because we're seeing them happen all over the world, and these protests happen all over the world, there is hope, I believe, for movement to a better place. Yes.
For our mixed message, we'd like to know where you stand with police reform. What do you think is the solution? Send us a DM and share with us through our blog, on our website at mixedlifeatl.com, and find us on social media at mixedlifeatl. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast and blog and be the first to receive our latest episodes. That's all we have for the show today. And until next time, stay safe and peace out. Mixed Life ATL is recorded in Atlanta, Georgia, and produced by SDB 360 LLC and Capacity Media. You can hear us wherever mainstream podcasts can be found. For information on how to advertise your business on this podcast, please message us at mixedlifeatl.com.